We're now at the third session dealing with America's debt, the dollar, and the global economy. And in some ways, Carmen Reinhardt's remarks in the opening panel sort of prefaced the issues and dilemmas that we're going to be trying to address here. To remind you, she pointed out that unlike countries that have faced other banking and financial crises, we're dealing with essentially a global economic crisis. And the U.S., partly because of the structure of trade and international capital flows of the past 2 decades, may not be in the position to enjoy the benefits of being able to export its way out of the crisis, or to have global demand contribute in any meaningful way, at least in the short term, to helping resolve America's debt and growth challenge. So the issue, at the same time as Steve Clemens raised, there's any number of concerns about the role of the dollar in the international system and whether or not the investment community in the United States and globally might at some point assign a much higher risk premium to holding dollar-denominated assets, and whether indeed that is a good thing or a bad thing. We actually have some very interesting and again somewhat unconventional views represented, I think, on the panel. You won't hear the same old arguments repeated amongst our panelists. And let me briefly, now that many of you are able to return to your seats, introduce our panelists. On my immediate right is Subramanian, who's a senior fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics, as well as a senior fellow and senior research professor at the Center for Global Development at the Johns Hopkins University. He was formerly assistant director of the research department at the International Monetary Fund. Arvin, unfortunately, is going to have to leave a little early because he's much in demand, has another speaking engagement. You may have seen recently his Financial Times piece about how the U.S. needs help with the global rebalancing agenda. Bibow is a research scholar. He's professor of economics at Skidmore College and a research scholar at the Levi Economics Institute, who is an expert on central banking and international financial system. He's the author of a new book, Keynes on Monetary Policy, Finance and Uncertainty, Liquidity Preference Theory and the Global Financial Crisis, which is published by Rutledge. Then we have Zachary Karabell, who's the president of River Trice Research, the author of the forthcoming book, which will be out in October, on perhaps one of the most important topics facing the global economy, entitled Superfusion: How China and America Became One Economy and Why the World's Prosperity Depends on It. Zachary also is a board member of the New America Foundation. And finally, Douglas Rediker. Doug is director of our Global Strategic Finance Initiative at the New America Foundation. He had a very distinguished career as a senior investment banker and private equity investor for Salomon Brothers, Merrill Lynch, and Lehman Brothers, and had played a particularly instrumental role in expanding investment banking in Eastern Europe after the collapse of communism there. We're going in this order. Bibow will be going first, then followed by Arvin, Zachary, and Doug. Each of you have 6 to 8 minutes, and we'll open up for questions and discussion. Jorg?
My main aim is going to be to shift the focus of the discussion to the global setting of what is going on. I'm going to emphasize the role of the US dollar as key reserve currency and the special role of the United States within the world monetary and financial order. When this crisis started, we used to refer to it as a subprime crisis, which was in a sense appropriate because that's where the trouble first emerged. Although by now, we probably understand that subprime is only the tip of the iceberg of the whole issue. Nowadays, we tend to see the Lehman failure as the decisive moment that really pushed the US and global economies off the cliff. And again, there may be some truth in that view, but I would argue that Lehman was only really the trigger of events that were in place, that had built up over a longer period of time, and that is very closely related to the world monetary and financial order in which the US and the US dollar play a very special role. This order is asymmetric, it is US centered. US financial institutions enjoy something like supremacy in global finance. Now, this has induced particular kinds of macro policies in the rest of the world. Defensive macro policies, countries seeking protection in the form of maintaining competitive exchange rates, running current account surpluses, and accumulating dollar assets as self-insurance. Seeking protection. Now, what happens if the rest of the world is seeking protection in that kind of way? The rest of the world is trying to have competitive exchange rates, trying to export, trying to accumulate dollars. It means that there is a huge deflationary force in place. In fact, under the gold standard, it can only lead to outright deflation. Everybody's trying to export and accumulate gold. There's only one consequence possible, deflation. Now, we're not on a gold standard, we're on a US dollar standard. And that highlights the special role, and I would also say responsibility in a way, of the US as key reserve currency issuer to respond to these policies, and that is what we have seen in the US. These policies in the rest of the world have induced over-expansionary macro policies, mainly in the form of very expansionary monetary policies. Now, how does monetary policy work? Low interest rates, easy credit, rising asset prices. That's how we stimulate private spending. And I will get back to that point in a moment. First, I would like to say a few things about the so-called Bretton Woods II hypothesis. It was in 2003 that Michael Doley, David Folkers-Landau, and Peter Garber came up with this idea of a revised Bretton Woods system, also known as Bretton Woods II, which takes this global perspective, which makes the case that a US current account deficit may be sustainable. The US may run kind of permanent current account deficits, because some kind of symbiosis of interests seem to exist between those countries running surpluses, who wanted to stimulate employment and development, and the United States being in that special position, enjoying a comparative advantage in producing safe assets. So notice the global perspective in this Bretton Woods II hypothesis, focusing on the special role of the dollar. That's all fine, and the title suggests there was some continuity with Bretton Woods I, the previous system, only that the periphery, what they call the periphery, the surplus countries, is a different group of countries. Now, there was a fundamental flaw or oversight afflicting this view about the supposed sustainability, namely that while official authorities in the rest of the world were accumulating safe assets as part of their strategy of seeking protection, the assets which actually stimulated spending in the US turned out to be rather unsafe, because it was not public debt, it was private debt. in private spending or overspending, which was providing the counterpart, the offset, to the deflationary forces that were arriving at the US from the rest of the world. And that, as we now fairly clearly know, turned out to be unsustainable, and I would therefore be willing to declare that Bretton Woods II is dead, and it cannot be easily revived, because this process of consumer-led growth with the saving rate continuously declining cannot go on forever unless we expect the saving rate to go to -10 or -20%. Now, if Bretton Woods II is dead, it raises the question, where are we going? And here is where what I dubbed Bretton Woods III might be emerging, where public debt is taking on the role that private debt used to play in the previous Bretton Woods II system. Now, in a way, this has come about as a result of the stimulus programs put in place and so on. Public debt is replacing private debt. We currently tend to see this as something only temporary to reboot the economy. It seems to me that we may have to consider the possibility that this may turn out to be a somewhat longer-term situation, which links up with ideas we have heard in the previous session. So notice under Bretton Woods III, official authorities in the rest of the world would still continue to accumulate safe assets, but this time around it would actually be those very safe assets which also stimulate the spending in the US. Also importantly, under Bretton Woods III, the need for this kind of arrangement and the scope for the US to play this role depends on what other countries in the rest of the world are doing. So it depends on what happens in China, right? Right now we seem to observe some kind of rebalancing taking place in China towards domestic demand. The more China rebalances away from export-led growth to domestic demand, the less the need for the US to continue to play that role. As to the developing world at large, many developing countries used to run current account surpluses. To the extent that the developing world at large moves away from that strategy, again, there would be less need and less scope for the US to play its role along these Bretton Woods III lines that I indicated. So it depends on what the rest of the world is doing, and I should also mention Japan and Germany and Europe in this context. Other important players which have shown, unfortunately in the past, that they are quite unable to depend on domestic demand-led growth, and therefore also were part of this global constellation that made the US consumer, act as borrower and spender of last resort. So much for Bretton Woods III. I sketched the outline. I mean, there is another possibility if China at some point were to mature and the renminbi were to mature, and China would not at all depend on export-led growth anymore, and perhaps India at some point might reach that point, and perhaps even Europe might finally get its act together and not rely on the US for stimulating growth. Then we might perhaps at some point, and I'm talking about decades here, move towards a more symmetric system in which the US dollar does no longer play the role as key reserve currency. But we're not there. And as long as the US is in that position, the question is, how can the US play that role? Now, it seems to me monetary policy can no longer do it, so we need some kind of change in guards away from monetary policy to fiscal policy. And that involves public debt, and therefore we need to be somewhat flexible and open-minded and creative to start thinking anew about public debt rather than panic when we hear about public debt. Because in the previous session we heard that actually there are many useful things that could be financed with public debt. And we could also see it as an opportunity. As long as the dollar enjoys this position, we could actually fulfill this role and responsibility and do useful things with it.
Thank you.
And and confine myself to three questions. So the three questions are: does the dollar need to decline? One. Two, is the dollar under threat of losing its preeminence as an international reserve currency? And three, do we need better mechanisms for international cooperation to ensure that the lessons of this crisis or the experience of this crisis won't get repeated in the future? So let me take each of these questions in turn. Does the dollar need to decline? If you think about it from a systemic point of view and look at the crisis and say, part of the problem, part of the origin of the crisis was the so-called global imbalances, the large current account surpluses run by the Asians and for some time by the oil exporting countries. It fed this liquidity boom, relaxed lending standards, and fueled the asset price bubble. It wasn't the only reason. It may not have been the most important reason, but global imbalances did feed the asset bubble and cause some of the problem. So from a global perspective, we need current account deficit in the US to decline, and that will require a decline in the dollar. But that's from a systemic perspective. From the point of view of the US, also, I think the dollar needs to decline. And this was made very clear in a speech that Larry Summers gave at the Peterson Institute, where he essentially said that the US needs a new model of growth, more export-based, investment-based, and less consumption-based, to get away from the whole finance-intensive model of growth of the past. But he's also outlined in the past a strategic imperative for the United States to reduce its current account deficit, which is that the strategic imperative of reducing dependence on foreigners. We saw way back at the start of the crisis when some of the banks were in trouble. We had to go to the Gulf countries to bail out some of these institutions, and that puts a curb on American influence. The fact that the US needs to borrow so heavily from overseas does also constrain American use of American power internationally. So both from an international perspective, a global perspective, and from the point of view of the United States, it's clear that the dollar needs to decline. And some estimates that my colleagues at the Institute have said that we need a decline of about let's say 20-25% from now. This is in the medium run. Question number two. Is the dollar under threat of losing its preeminence as a global currency? Now, it's absolutely consistent to say that the dollar needs to decline in the medium run, and to assert at the same time that in itself should not create any, that should not in itself undermine the role of the United States dollar as a preeminent reserve currency, because the way to reconcile the two is that we need to have an orderly adjustment of the exchange rate rather than a disruptive adjustment of the exchange rate. In fact, over the last, until the crisis, over the 3 years preceding that, the dollar did decline by about 25% in real trade weighted terms, with no threat to the dollar as an international reserve currency. So we need, in some sense, a repeat of that going forward. Now, but there is one thing that's important to understand, that the two can be reconciled if there is an orderly decline, but that can only happen, I think, or the key to that happening is if the United States gets its long-run fiscal situation under control. If the fiscal situation is credibly brought back to a sustainable trajectory, we can see an orderly adjustment of the exchange rate. However, if it's not brought under control, then we get a disruptive decline of the dollar, and that would undermine confidence in the American currency, but not because of the pure value of the currency going down, because it would reflect something deeper. It would reflect the inability of the American political system to come up with a new social contract. The existing contract, at least given the debt trajectory, is based on spending like socialists and taxing like libertarians. That contract is not sustainable for the future. And the inability to get that would smack of this deeper problem with the political system, and that would mean there would seriously be a loss of confidence in the United States currency, but more broadly. Now, what does this all mean for the international system of cooperation that we have going forward? My third question. Do we need better mechanisms? I mean, as I said, the crisis was in part global in origin, not completely, but certainly it was. And it was also clear that the existing mechanisms for international cooperation, namely whatever we had as part of the IMF, World Bank, WTO, it didn't work. I mean, the IMF has done a very good job, in responding to the crisis, what I would call, the cleanup phase. But in the run-up phase, there was a failure on the part of the IMF. It couldn't effectively get the surplus countries to adjust. It couldn't get China to adjust its exchange rate. And on the other side, of course, it couldn't do anything about the regulatory and policy failures in the United States that led to the crisis. We also need better mechanisms going forward because of the point that Carmen raised, and that was implicit in Larry Summers' speech, that if going forward, if the United States is going to curb its profligate ways and going to run smaller current account deficits, that means that something has to give at the international level. If the US is running smaller current account deficits, someone on the other side will have to run smaller current account surpluses. And the fear, of course, going forward is that, as Carmen said, not every country can export its way out of this global turmoil and the recession. The world is a closed economy. We don't export to Mars. And therefore, if one country wants to export its way out of trouble, something has to give on the other side. Now, are we likely to get this mechanism for international cooperation? I am very despondent. One, because, although, again, as I said, the IMF has done well in the cleanup phase, there is nothing that's happened that gives me any assurance that going forward, we have mechanisms in place to avoid the problems of the future. And frankly, let's face the elephant or the dragon in the room. The fact is that the one other player which is running a current account surplus, China, is in a dilemma. If it's wedded to its mercantilist growth strategy, that comes into tension with its international obligations of not running these current account surpluses and creating all the problems. And frankly, I mean, it's easy. I wrote a paper in Foreign Affairs saying, well, the IMF has failed on the exchange rate issue, therefore we should get the WTO involved because it has better governance mechanisms, more effective enforcement. But that, I think, looking back, is a little bit glib because, frankly, we may have reached a situation where, inducing Chinese cooperation through sticks and carrots is perhaps not possible. Unless China voluntarily thinks it's in its interest to be a global responsible player, we're not going to, be able to either browbeat or, provide sweetened pills for China to cooperate. So going forward, the dilemma remains. We need better mechanisms, but it's not obvious how we're going to get them.
Zachary, who's just written a book about the U.S.-China relationship.
So, let me be needfully provocative. And try to do this in some coherent order. There clearly is a narrative and an assumption and a story about what's gone on during the past year, some of it populist, some of it political, some of it economic, and some of it investing. But it all tends to circle around the idea that leverage got out of hand, that American consumers in particular were living beyond their means, that a series of global imbalances evolved, whereby there was overconsumption in the United States and over savings in Asia and other parts of the world, and where some parts of the world were too export dependent, others were too much reliant on cheap imports, and that all these imbalances are coming home to roost, much like chickens. And that what we're in now is a phase of redressing these issues and restoring or recreating or perhaps creating a kind of global balance. I think almost every aspect of everything I just said is misleading, wrong, unhelpful, you name it. And frankly, obviously, I'm just one person with an opinion. But there's so much embedded in those viewpoints. First that's embedded is that there is such a thing called a global economic system that was in balance that got out of balance, because the world imbalance implies and is in reference to a balance. I don't know when that balance ever existed in the global economy. I don't really think there is a global economic system that we can speak of as a static thing. And certainly one aspect of macroeconomics that has always been troublesome is its ability to create a sense of a global system, largely because the entire field of economics grew up in the late 19th century at a period of time when the nation state, from a macroeconomic perspective, was the primary unit of analysis, and the notion was that everything that happened economically had to be in balance within this closed system, as Arvind just talked about. Now, it may be true that the world is a closed system relative to Mars, but it's also true that the components of that system, nations, companies, individuals, peoples, are in a much more fluid state than national borders would suggest. And so the idea that every nation has to be in balance, not imbalance, but in balance, is, I think, an old notion that bears increasingly less relevance to the world we actually live in, and that there isn't any really good framework or system that would help us explain the world that we live in. And so being human beings who crave a certain level of certainty and order fall back on concepts that may be old but are the only ones that we have. And so I don't know what a global balance would look like. I do know that the notion of being over-levered, right? Certainly we can all accept that there is a point in time or a point in absolute numbers where debt becomes too much. But it's also true that if you look over the past 100 years, that point has been ever more extended. And to the point where the kinds of debt that we would all consider to be reasonable and even wise, mortgage debt, I'm not talking about subprime mortgage debt, I'm talking about the fact that 92% of the people who buy homes in the United States, even with the past crisis, were current on their mortgages, or that 91 or 92% were current on their credit cards. Which means that on the whole, if you're going to make an accurate generalization about the United States, the generalization would be that the vast majority of people take on an amount of debt that is both reasonable and feasible for their incomes. Some of the variability of whether it's 92 or 94 has to do with, did they lose a job, is there a sudden healthcare crisis? Not necessarily was the debt they took on at the time they took it unreasonable. So the amount of debt that people take on that they service, and service adequately and accurately, is vastly greater than it was during the Great Depression. It's vastly greater than it was during 1970. And all the figures that Cheryl has compiled and others about the amount of debt, household debt, going from whatever 20% to 120%, shows that in fact that the amount of debt has ballooned, but it's also true that the ability of most people to service that has kept pace with it ballooning, either because interest rates are lower or because technology, which has become kind of a bad word in financial circles because it helped facilitate derivatives, many of which were foolish, but many of which have been part and parcel of the ability of people to take on a much larger amount of debt that they will never repay. Most people who take on a mortgage in their home will never pay for their home. It's revolving debt. It's part of the cost of them living. And so I don't think it's clear what over-levered is, meaning it's not clear what the untenable point is except when it becomes untenable. And it's not clear that the reasons for it being untenable are so clear. I mean, we know that there was a proximate cause to the financial crisis that had to do with a huge amount of global leverage being built on a very, very tiny aspect of the U.S. economy, namely the subprime space, and that most of that leverage was created in toto between 2005 and early 2007 and got exported very quickly by technology around the world. So we know that happened. Does that mean that the absolute amount of that debt was itself a problem had the underlying assets been of somewhat higher quality? We'll never know because we don't get to replay the tape. Current accounts being out of balance. The way in which current accounts get calculated is so fundamentally flawed given the way most commerce occurs, then I'm not sure it's that meaningful anymore to use it as a litmus point, because it fails to capture a lot of trade flows adequately, because it just treats, you know, a port as a place where things come in or come out, and capital is something that comes in or comes out, and if it goes out, it's a negative, and if it comes in, it's a positive. But it doesn't account for if GE makes a series of refrigerators in China with a joint venture, some of which it sells in China, some of which it sells in the US. If those come back to the US, they're an import. You know, Goodyear's tires that are now going to be subject to a 35% tariff are still Goodyear's tires that, you know, it's a US company that lists in the United States, that pays some nominal taxes, that keeps people employed in varying degrees because of that corporate entity doing business. So a lot of that doesn't get captured in current accounts. You know, in the case of China, if something gets made in something gets made in southern China and sold in northern China, and often even with the infrastructure developments in China, it could be more efficient to transport that item via Hong Kong, via the sea. That item then gets counted as an export to Hong Kong and an import into China. And if it then goes to the United States, then it's an export from China and an import into the United States. And if it was a GE product in the first place, it gets counted 4 times in 4 different ways and shows up in everybody's current account. None of these statistics evolved at a point in time historically, i.e. the mid-20th century or before, when any of these things that are now manifestly true today existed. So we're measuring a world with old statistics and old measures that I think is no longer adequate for the world we're in. So I'm not in any way convinced that the narrative that we have for what went on is an adequate narrative for what went on, and therefore a lot of what we are saying we now need to do may or may not do us any particular good. There are things that are clear. You know, it is certainly clear that the growth model of the United States isn't working insofar as it is no longer succeeding in providing many tens of millions or hundreds of millions of people with the level of affluence commensurate with their desire for affluence. Now, that does not mean that there aren't a lot of people in incredibly dire circumstances, of which there are in the United States, whether it's 45 million uninsured, whether it's 9.7% unemployed, or another 7 or 8% who are underemployed. So you're dealing with an economic system that's leaving tens of millions, if not 100 million people, in a very tenuous situation, even relative to real needs: housing, shelter, food, healthcare. But it's also true that a lot of the growth paradigm that's broken is the growth paradigm that made people feel they needed a 4,000 square foot home when they had a 3,000 square foot home, or a 5,000 square foot home when they had a 4,000 square foot home. This is not an indictment of people's desires, it's simply an observation that when we say the growth model is broken, what's broken is that the United States is no longer able to provide a level of growth commensurate with its desire for growth. And clearly what has to give is either the model has to be reinvented and growth has to kick into higher gear so that desires are again met, or desires have to recalibrate so that they are no longer in excess of the system's ability to provide them. And I have no answer to what that is, although judging from the way in which we are currently dealing with this particular crisis, it would seem that a great deal of hope is being placed on the ability of the system to generate growth again to meet those excessive desires, rather than a recalibration of those desires to meet the level of growth. It is also unequivocally true that there is incredible growth in the global economy, and incredible growth in places like Brazil and India and China, and some satellite areas of the world that are themselves derivatives of the energy and action in those parts of the world. It is unquestionably true that the growth in those parts of the world bears a huge debt, pun intended, to the efforts of the United States and Europe to some degree over the past 50 years to create the global conditions for that growth in the first place. So in many sense, the growth model is working fantastically well in China and India and Brazil, while not adequately enough relative to desires in the United States, and that a lot of companies that are American companies and to some degree European multinationals are at the center of that growth and benefiting hugely from it. So you can indeed have a period of time where you have immense corporate profitability for the years to come, as we've begun to see, and very bad economic growth in the countries in which those companies are technically domiciled. To the point where, it is true that in the past decade alone, the percentage of the S&P 500 profits that derive from growth outside the United States has gone from just about 20% to over 50% this year, and that has been accelerated by the past year, but not created by the past year, because it was 45% 2 years ago. And what this does in terms of debt and leverage in the United States is there are multiple income streams that are going into servicing this debt, many of which we know about, whether it's China purchasing treasuries, and yes, it's true that China's purchase of U.S. treasuries has decreased over the past 6 months, but I think until you see a chronic withdrawal of China from the U.S. debt market, rather than simply a decrease in the intensity, you can't really say that China is any less committed or any less needful of U.S. debt, because they're intertwined in this system as well. So they are in an economic path that is so intertwined with the U.S. economy that they can't just decide because they'd like to detach from it, which they certainly would like to, unequivocally, just as we would like to not need other people lending us money in order to sustain the spending that we've needed to undertake in a period of crisis. But what that means going forward is much more opaque, in that it may be true, or rather I would agree that it is unequivocally true, that there is some point at which debt and this system becomes untenable. The problem is we're not there, and the past year is, I think, in retrospect, more of a warning shot across the bow of we're in an incredibly interconnected system whereby the risks for global meltdown are unprecedented. But it is also true that we haven't triggered those risks such that the global system has melted down. Now, 2 years from now, this could prove to be one of these false bottoms, and we could all be sitting around, not here, but in DuPont Circle, talking about how, in fact, this was a false bottom. But right now, it's not. And it's clear that the system is able to maintain this simply because it is, in fact, maintaining it. That may seem like a tautology, but in my view, it's also a reality that bears recognizing. In terms of the dollar, and I'll end with that, what's intriguing about the dollar is that the world, because it is an emerging system that has to have some common reference points. The WTO, for instance, is an attempt to create a common reference point about trade. The IMF may morph into a common reference point about finance, or it may not, depending on what happens. But the dollar does serve as a kind of economic lingua franca that allows commerce to occur more smoothly. It's entirely possible, albeit not familiar, that the dollar could remain the reserve currency and become increasingly detached from the United States as an economy. Certainly giving the United States greater rope either to save itself or hang itself than most economies and countries have, because it has the latitude of other people needing its currency, and it does maintain some control of its printing presses. Although, frankly, the more in debt, i.e. the more interlinked we become to other economies, the less de facto control we actually have as a sovereign nation over our own printing presses. We have the technical control, but we don't really have the ability to make those decisions without huge consequences. So it's entirely possible the dollar detaches from the United States economy, but remains a global currency of last resort, again, benefiting the United States, but not as much as we think. Much the way English has remained the lingua franca of India well after the British have left, because in a world of multiple languages, if you're going to knit something together in a common society, you need a lingua franca. Does the fact that English is spoken in India benefit England? No. Does it benefit the United States? Maybe a tad. It made India a better place for outsourcing because there was English skills to tap into. But on the whole, you'd have to say that those two things became rather separate. So you can have corporate profits detaching from the United States, even though they're U.S. companies, and you can have the dollar detaching from the United States, even though it's the U.S. currency, some of which will indeed benefit the United States, but not to the degree that we commonly think. So I know that doesn't leave with any strong conclusions other than, if anything that the past year should have dictated, it's kind of be wary of the answers that we think we know, and of the lessons we think we've learned, and of the frameworks we think define the world we're in. Because increasingly, there are aspects of those frameworks that are absolutely central to the world we're in, but there are many aspects that are anachronistic and archaic, and I believe are misleading, and will not lead us to constructive answers about the world we are in and the world that we're going to be in.
Thank you.
Dominance for the currency as a global reserve asset, which in turn will lead to a sharp decline in the international political standing and overall global stature of this country on the world stage. And yet here we are, discussing ways to restore sustainable domestic and global growth, including how to address global imbalances that cause at least some of the current economic crisis. How do we, picking up on Chris's point, how do we spur inflation? And in general, how do we engage in policies which may very well result in an even weaker US dollar? So when we blend foreign policy onto economic policy, it leads to an interesting dilemma. Are we really left with a policy choice between growing our economy or preserving the US dollar on the international stage and by extension the US standing in the world? And thankfully my answer to that is no. In fact, I think that one of our principal policy goals should be to try and have it both ways, which is not really as outlandish as it might seem when you consider that the most dramatic impact of inflation and a weakened dollar may well be felt by those countries like China and other East Asian surplus countries that have in fact benefited from an economic model built on the creation of domestic surpluses and by voluntarily buying and holding huge reserves denominated in US dollars. It is not inconceivable that some US inflation and dollar weakening could be an integral part of any US economic recovery and a means to lessen the pain of our increasing debt burden. But in spite of concerns about the value of the dollar, foreign purchasers of US dollars nevertheless continue to support it as the dominant reserve currency, thereby providing us with a significant strategic, financial, and political benefits that come with the privilege of printing the world's primary transaction and reserve currency. Now, this isn't going to continue forever, and because it isn't, we should recognize that this is a unique opportunity. We should not confuse the value of the dollar with its overall international role. It has actually been the case for much of the last decade that the dollar has lost significant value relative to other currencies and to gold, but it has nevertheless maintained its dominant international reserve currency position. Consider that over the past 35 years, during most of which time our official policy was to support a strong dollar, the US currency declined from over 300 yen to below 100. The price of gold has risen from its Bretton Woods peg of $35 an ounce to $200 an ounce in 1974, and now today it hovers around $1,000 an ounce. And over the past 8 years, we've seen the euro strengthen from a low of 83 US cents to almost $1.50 today. And yet, in the years since the original Bretton Woods system collapsed, the dollar continues to represent roughly 2/3 of the world's official reserves, and purchasers of this currency do so voluntarily. The dollar's global role is based on the overall relative benefits of holding and transacting in dollars, and not just a function of its absolute value. While US deficits may call into question some economic fundamentals and the store value function of the dollar, we should not underestimate the power of inertia and incumbency, as well as the enormous costs and impediments to migrating away from the dollar at the micro, macro, banking, trade, and political levels. We also shouldn't forget that in spite of arguments about the impending threats posed by the euro, the SDR, and the renminbi, today there really is no alternative to the US dollar as a reserve currency in international commerce and finance, and that is likely to be the case for some time to come. The dollar is so entrenched today in our global financial and trading systems that any discussion about the future of the US dollar is really essentially a discussion about the future of existing monetary, trade, and financial systems around the world. It's much more than mutually assured destruction regarding the value of reserves on the Chinese central bank balance sheet. Any discussion about the future of the dollar is central to the world's financial system and must involve the world's most important countries, and should take into account the interests of its most powerful private actors as well, banks, investors, traders, and companies. One could argue that maintaining stability and avoiding chaos in the dollar markets is central to avoiding a collapse of the entire system itself, and that everyone has a stake. Now, thankfully, with the darkest days of the financial crisis hopefully behind us, but with continuing uncertainty about what lies ahead, I would like to see the U.S. use this month's G20 summit to announce a new intensive effort to comprehensively address issues including global imbalances, reserve currency issues, and the shape and structure of institutions that will serve as the foundations on which future global growth will rest. How about the U.S. taking the lead and proposing a real second Bretton Woods? A comprehensive long-term structural rethink of a new global monetary system where the U.S. is willing to discuss issues like the future role of the U.S. dollar, but as part of a package along with difficult issues like voting rights in multilateral institutions, the establishment of a new international financial clearing system, the creation of an IMF substitution account, and new rules to address global trade imbalances. There's enough in there to make everyone uncomfortable, and I doubt the dollar would weaken as a result of such a proposal. Now, China, of course, occupies a central position here. As the largest holder of U.S. dollar reserves, it plays a unique role in any discussion about the future of the U.S. dollar and also about global imbalances. The Chinese, among other things, understandably want a greater role in international multilateral institutions, the inclusion of the renminbi in a future composition of the SDR, and the ability to access the substitution account at the IMF so as to begin to migrate away from unhedged U.S. dollar exposure that reaches into the trillions. But the U.S. current account deficit is falling, and the U.S. Treasury market today is more reliant on U.S. savers and the Fed than on the Chinese. That means that increased U.S. borrowing doesn't necessarily mean increased dependence on foreign governments, and on China in particular. So if the Chinese are actually worried about the risks of U.S. inflation and the future of the dollar, we should be confident enough to discuss it. But likewise, we need to get global imbalances on the table as part of a frank and constructive conversation that transcends short-term nationalistic politics. The alternative of the U.S., China, the EU, and other major global players avoiding tough issues or acting unilaterally poses an increased risk that today's nascent economic recovery deteriorates, or worse, that it develops into a larger and more problematic geopolitical conflict. When it comes to the dollar, current and future expected deficits may well lead to a weaker U.S. dollar. But a weaker dollar might have its place and doesn't mean a weaker U.S. on the global stage. Ironically, a weaker dollar doesn't necessarily mean a less dominant one.
Thank you, Doug. And Arvin wasn't protesting your comments. He had to do for the other speaking engagement, because actually you two were actually points overlap to some degree. I want to start off the questioning by which all you can enter in, but I think Zachary raised some important points about how we measure, whether we have the proper measurements to be able to analyze and understand, particularly when it comes to the question of imbalances. And so by using national accounts, we're using them as stand-ins for other things that we actually need to know. And maybe the challenge, Zachary, is more in that we don't have the right national global policy instruments and institutions as opposed to purely the anachronism of how to account for things. For example, there was an imbalance between, and there still is an imbalance in the world economy between capacity, productive capacity, savings, and demand, as backed up by real wages and incomes and ability to take on debt. Now, that gets expressed to some degree through national accounts, the U.S. current account deficit, and current account surplus economies. And so the mechanism for change either becomes in terms of adjusting U.S. monetary or fiscal policy, or the value of the dollar, because that's the main mechanism by which one makes adjustments in capacity or demand at this point in juncture. So it does seem like we have a major challenge going forward where we do have to deal with imbalances, but we have to be much more creative in understanding the relationship between national and global policy instruments and the ones that we do have available. So I just wanted to throw that out for you, Zachary, to comment, but also Doug and Hork to weigh in.
part of the statement is not that there are no imbalances, it's that kind of answering what that is either difficult or impossible given our current tools. And the tool issue is one that I feel very strongly about. I mean, the fact is creating data and statistics in the world we're living in is immensely complicated, time-consuming, and costly. So if you're really going to create global economic data, someone actually has to pay for it. And it's not really in the interest of any national, it has not been seen as in the interest of any national government to pay for it. Sure, the World Health Organization creates data about health, and the UN has some areas where it creates data about demographics or displaced populations, but on the whole, there's no one paying thousands upon thousands of statisticians and census officials and all of it to either create global level data or think about what that would even look like. And the imbalances, by the way, could be much worse than we think. In that the disparities between where there's savings and where there's consumption could be much more extreme than we currently believe them.
Well, and I think that was the case.
Well, but I mean, if you took Hernando Soto's view that there's an immense amount of embedded liquidity or untapped liquidity, right, in property and housing in lots of the developing world still, and that it takes legal systems and banking systems to unlock that. In which case, the disparity between global liquidity out there and liquidity here is much greater than we currently think. Although that's a recipe for continued deflation, and that the world's just flooded with there's plenty of money, and there's plenty of liquidity. The cost of capital need not be expensive. Counter the belief that we've created too much and there's it's going to be scarce.
Let's open it up to questions. Danny has his microphone in the back.
The stalwarts have remained in the audience.
Chachen, freelance correspondent. How do you deal with coming consequence of printing so much money and huge deficit created in the last 12 months? Thank you.
My turn. Printing so much money, large deficits. I think there is a lot of confusion about this issue in the public about this printing of money. What has happened essentially is that a good part of money markets that used to be on private balance sheets have moved to the Fed balance sheet. As long as they were on private balance sheets, we saw them as normal and not inflationary and whatsoever, but now that they appear on the Fed's balance sheet, we count them towards the monetary base, and we panic about the supposed inflationary forces that are meant to emerge from that process. As I said, I think that is totally confused. The Fed has just substituted for what was previously taking place on private balance sheets. Now that doesn't make it any more inflationary than before whatsoever. And to the extent that the financial system really revives and normalizes, those transactions should more and more over time return to private balance sheets, and they would automatically move back from the Fed's balance sheet to private balance sheets. The unwinding, the exit strategies to a very large extent happen automatically for the simple fact that the way monetary policy works is they set the price of money, they set the short-term rate of interest. And how much reserves they actually supply to the system is more or less endogenous. So as soon, or the more the private system revitalizes and gets back to normal, we will endogenously see the monetary base falling correspondingly. Now, I'm not predicting this to happen over the next couple of months. This might very well turn out to be a lengthy process, but I don't see any reason whatsoever to interpret this development as inflationary.
Yes, I'm Paul London. I was the Deputy Undersecretary of Commerce for Economics and Statistics for a while in the Clinton administration. And you're sort of pointing out one of my hobby horses here. The data is enormously misleading. and I think we rely on it much too much in many different areas. As I mentioned before, I wrote a book about competition. You have this data out there. It says somebody's making 5 million cars, another country's making 5 million cars. You can't tell the level of competition. You can't tell anything from this. So I think this whole reliance on data in this kind of a discussion, I think it's much too great. I think we would be much better making more of these arguments on a historic basis, talking about the Depression of the 1870s, talking about the Great Depression, talking about 1907, talking about why the Fed was created, talking about why the Treasury used to create money, but it was sort of passed over to the Fed. I think there's a lot more. I think the conceptual problems of data, which have been well laid out in a lot of different theses over the years, I think they tend to get swept out under the rug, and we look for data, which again, in my view, is often very, very misleading.
Thank you. And I think this probably calls, at one point we were going to do a project on remapping the global economy that actually tried to address this, and maybe Zachary will spur us to do that at some point. Jamie Galbraith.
James Galbraith. I'm going to direct a question at the absent Arvin Subramanian. Perhaps ask for a comment on it from Jorg or anybody else who'd care to make a comment. Arvin argued in favor of a approximately 25% fall in the exchange value of the dollar and a sharp reduction in the current account deficit of the United States and rebalancing of the current account. And that would seem to me to be approximately consistent with, let's say, a rise in the price of oil to $95 a barrel, maybe a reduction of imports by 3% of GDP, an increase of exports by a couple of percent of GDP, something on those orders of magnitude to achieve the goals that he laid out. And I wonder if any of the panel could comment, first of all, on what the implications of such a strategy would be for the overall reduction of private incomes, of employment, and living standards that would be required to meet the import goals and would be affected through the decline in the exchange rate. And secondly, as for the kind of surge of exports that would be required, what they might consist of, who would step up and buy them, and how would those purchases be financed? In other words, it seems to me that we've got a strategy here. I think that it is a politically unrealistic strategy because it would require a set of sacrifices that the population would simply not be willing to accept. And the implication of hearing it is that we have to come up with something which works better from the standpoint of the performance of the American economy than that.
From what you're saying, Jamie, I'm not sure it's economically possible either.
Yeah, I mean, I would
giving the structural. But Zachary.
Yeah, I would say that. I mean, the economic issues are even more immense in that. I mean, one, even if theoretically you could do some of these things and there was people to buy whatever was being produced, much of what's being produced is I mean, we're under capacity. Capacity utilization in the U.S. is down in the mid-60s. So there's a lot more we could manufacture at current capacity levels without necessarily adding vastly more jobs, because as you know, a lot of this capacity can be augmented substantially without adding any more labor. So you export more, but you do nothing to deal with the structural unemployment issues, because most of the unemployment is based on the fact that whatever we make, we can make with fewer people, and we can make a lot more than we're currently making with fewer people. You know, it does in my mind, and it's lovely to argue with someone who's not here, because it's you always end up feeling like you've won. That closing the current account deficit not only makes no sense and is not feasible, but is unnecessary. In that, you know, sort of back. I mean, again, I'm one guy with an opinion, but the need to do this is vastly overstated, largely because there's a lot more flowing into our current account than shows up in it. And so I'm not so sure our current account is quite what it looks like. And again, I go back to the corporate profitability part. You know, the mismatch between the profit accounts and the current account is significant, and would take someone with much greater computational skills than mine to actually try to figure that out. I think it's probably doable, but difficult.
Doug?
I'm not going to take issue with any of that. The only point I would pick up on Jamie's premise of the question is you talked about commodity prices going up to, what'd you say, $95 a barrel. I think the economic impact of that would be significant within the country, obviously. You take these expected inflationary pressures and we talk about them in a theoretical context, those would hurt the real economy quite dramatically. But going back to the subtext of my presentation, I think the geopolitical impact of commodity prices in the dollar is the one thing I didn't raise that I would say is an ancillary but very important aspect of all of what we're talking about, which is that the one chink in my premise, which is the dollar is going to remain the reserve currency for years to come, regardless of what we do in terms of its store value function, is how it relates to commodity pricing. And so while that's not a direct response to your question, since you raised that, I just wanted to point that out, that is something that we should focus on as we look at the dollar and the overall impact globally.
Yeah, the U.S. pursuing a strategy of export-led growth, I have a very hard time imagining how that is supposed to work. I mean, we've had it now for a couple of years, for 2 years since the crisis started, because imports were falling faster than exports. So in that sense, we had export-led growth. But as a longer-term solution to see the U.S. current account deficit shrink and disappear, and the key reserve currency is you're running an export-led growth strategy, I don't see how that is supposed to work. Historically, there is the example in Europe with Germany pursuing an undervaluation strategy and running current account surpluses at the same time with the Deutschmark being the key currency. It never worked in Europe. And I don't see how this is supposed to work for the world. And that brings me back to, you were talking about the notion of global balance or out of balance, that this is a notion, a concept very hard to grasp. What does it actually mean? I agree with that. It's not easy to say when is the world in balance or out of balance, and this is evolving over time. Now, the point I was making about my Bretton Woods 2, Bretton Woods 3 analysis was that if you look back historically, early 90s, Japan's crisis, ever since that time, Japan was relying on export-led growth. Domestic demand was dead. Germany was the next case, 92, 93 recession, when the Bundesbank, in response to unification, killed the German economy. Ever since then, Germany was relying on export-led growth. With the Maastricht Treaty, this wisdom was exported to Europe. So Europe, the EU, Euroland in particular, became the next mercantilist candidate on the globe. Then the Asian crisis, 97, 98. Since then, more and more developing countries have turned their growth strategies around, became reliant on export-led growth, ran up current account surpluses. One example of that is China, and China's current account surplus really only after 2003 went through the roof. But that is the situation we were looking at. The rest of the world was trying to export, was trying to have a competitive exchange rate, was trying to accumulate dollars. That is a huge deflationary force in the global system. Right. I mentioned the gold standard would crack. Now, in order to retain balance, the reserve currency issuer has to offset this deflationary force. And that only works by U.S. macro policies, by overstimulating U.S. spending, which has to exceed U.S. income growth. And the problem with that was that it was based primarily on consumer spending, with a personal saving rate falling from 10% towards 0, and consumer indebtedness rising correspondingly. So if you look back at OECD, IMF projections as late as 2006, they were projecting that the U.S. current account deficit would rise to 7, 8, 10%, whatnot. So they were just extrapolating those trends. My point is, that's not possible. The system was unsustainable because it was relying on consumers ever more reducing their saving rate, getting ever more indebted. I don't doubt they would start borrowing again at some point. My point is that these tendencies were unsustainable.
Right, and driven by, in some ways, an imbalance between inordinate number of national economies that's chosen to organize themselves around export-led growth and neo-mercantilism.
So if the U.S. were to join that club, where are we?
Yes, well, that's the dilemma I think we face, and also the dilemma I think for Zachary's very interesting notion of the dollar detaching from the U.S. economy, because that leaves we'd be moving from a world, and it'd be interesting in your comments, a world of, where at least we have one reserve currency economy that's committed to an expansionary policy, to no center of institutional authority that's committed to jobs and full employment or expansionary economy. So the question is whether the dollar can detach from the U.S. economy without creating some functional substitute for the Fed and American fiscal policy someplace else in the world system.
Well, I mean, I think to some degree, these things evolve in slow motion, right? But to the degree that you do have Geithner, you do have others going to China as a way of placating or assuaging the current largest creditor, you do begin to have other voices fundamentally shaping interest rate policy, monetary policy. It's obviously not going to be direct, and it would never be able to be direct and politically palatable. I think one of the reasons that there hasn't been more tariffs and trade wars, other than what happened recently with tires, which is a tempest in a teapot, or a monkey wrench in an automobile, or some more appropriate metaphor, is that every time someone said, thought about doing it, someone said, well, great, but where's the money going to come from? So I think some of that, the constraints on the ability to actually set your own monetary policy has already set in. We may be the last to realize it or the last to accept it, but that doesn't mean it's not there. You gotta.
Thank you. My name is Leonard Oberlander. The point of my question is to address inflation as affected not only by currencies, financial instruments, financial policies, commodities prices, but inflation with regard to something that has not been discussed yet, and that's human capital. And income and savings, which was discussed earlier, is directly proportional to education and job categories. The major independent variable that drives income and savings are, in our country, the number of productive architects and engineers with regard to infrastructure and the employment of thousands of construction workers, primary care physicians with regard to health and productivity of workers, scientists, physicists, chemists, neuroscientists, and so forth, whose startup companies in this country attract investors, both American investors and international, technicians and accountants. These are the products of our educational system and an entire support structure for producing the brains. We're currently outsourcing many of these skilled functions while the existing brain power is becoming unemployed in many government and private sectors, as well as being recruited overseas with higher compensation packages. Revenue is coming in to pay for technological assets that are being sold abroad. How is this, how do you address this, aside from the statistics that have already been criticized, in affecting our future and the question of inflation?
The question relates to the role of productivity growth and the quality of human capital and holding down inflation. And let me sort of, because we're short of time and I want to get Pat Malloy and speak for the panel, and say that I think the general agreement is that your point is right on, and that these microeconomic issues of continue to encourage the improvement of human capital and productivity growth will be essential going forward to maintaining productivity growth and therefore allowing us to grow more rapidly with less inflation. I think we can all agree.
Although I will dissent a little on that. If you look at the unemployment statistics and you really break them down, the unemployment rate for people with the kind of qualifications you describe really is still below 5%. I mean, it's up from 2.5% a couple of years ago. Unfortunately, a lot of the knowledge workers who are getting seriously hit are either in finance or in the media, which are the two places that disseminate most of the information about what's going on in the employment land. So, but on the whole, most people with what you describe are not being comparatively decimated in this economy, other than clearly the proximate hit to their own savings and portfolios and confidence, but not yet. There's a lot more outsourcing fear around those categories than there is unemployment reality. There's some, but not nearly commensurate with the fear.
Pat Malloy.
Yeah, thank you very much. I was I'm with the U.S. China Commission, and I wanted to comment and then ask a question. I remember reading a book by Senator Schumer, Positively American, in which he commented that in the 1950s, 60s, even 70s, there was a coherence of interest between our multinational corporations and the national interest, but that there's been some divergence between the interest of the multinational corporations and their national interest. And Zachary, you seem to really make the point that the multinational corporations can do quite well by outsourcing production, technology, other things to China, maybe India, Brazil, and you comment how quickly they're growing. And then you commented Americans might have to lessen their expectations of growth. Do you think it would be in the national interest to begin to think how we could bring back the interest of the multinationals to be more coherent with the national interest in producing GDP in this country, so that America can have good jobs and good prospects? And I just wanted one more point. The China Commission recently did a hearing up in Rochester in which we brought in Dr. Willie Shih of Harvard University Business School. And he talked that we've been outsourcing so much now we've weakened what he called the industrial commons in this country, where we're losing our capacity to even make and innovate new products that can make our country wealthier. So I see this as an important issue to think about, how to re-incentivize this game, because it's clear to me that China does have a strategy to incentivize our corporations to move there. Thank you.
Zachary.
Do you want to comment first?
Yeah, a brief comment perhaps. The decisions of multinational corporations where to produce, where to invest, at least in part, depend on the infrastructure in place in the various locations available. And we've heard earlier, in an earlier session, that many countries around the globe undertake infrastructure investments. And this raises the issue whether this is not a challenge for the U.S. to upgrade U.S. infrastructure and thereby, which includes human capital, your point, make the U.S. a more attractive location for production, which links up with what was said in earlier sessions here about infrastructure investment and the role of fiscal policy or the role of private-public partnerships and so on.
I mean, first of all, it is absolutely a central and I think incredibly important question of can you align the interests of multinationals with the U.S. economy, particularly if they're U.S.-listed multinationals, which a considerable portion are. Some are European, some are Korean, some are Japanese. We could do a much better job, and I think companies themselves could do a much better job fleshing out the degree to which these are not quite as zero-sum as they seem, in that it is certainly true that the outsourcing has eliminated jobs in the United States, but it is also equally true that it's provided products for people that they need and want at a level that they couldn't otherwise afford at the price point they would be made here, i.e., all the aspects of daily living, and that there is a link there. There is also a linkage in that there is production in the United States that has continued because of demand globally. And I in the book, talk about a Caterpillar plant in Mississippi that stayed open because of business in China. And there are a lot of examples of that. The reality of manufacturing becoming less labor-intensive globally is not one that is purely an American issue. And I don't know what you do about that, meaning there's no way to set back the clock whereby the same number of people need to produce manufactured goods. There were 100 million farmers in the United States in 1900 who produced the 20th of the amount of food that 2 million farmers or combines now produce in the United States now, and manufacturing is on the same technological glide path. So how one squares that particular circle, I have absolutely no idea, and I'm not sure it's doable, which is not a particularly cheerful prognosis for the domestic U.S. economy as it applies to jobs. But it is certainly true that manufacturing remains profoundly productive and growing in the United States. It just isn't doing so with people. It's doing so with fewer people. U.S. exports to China have actually been growing more quickly than U.S. imports to China for 3 years, and now account for, you know the statistics better than I do, $80 billion a year, or $90 billion in imports, but it's dwarfed by $300 billion in imports. At least that's, the optics of it. So you ask the absolutely essential question, to which I think some of the answer is unequivocally grim when it comes to jobs. But some of the answer is a little more positive in that capital does flow back into the system. It flows back in the ability of the Chinese to lend to us, which I think is a two-edged sword, but a lot better than the one-edged sword of having nobody to lend to us. And it flows back in the form of profits, which we do not know how to tax because of the differential tax regimes, and the problem of repatriating profits and the disinclination of companies to do so is not one that anybody's really figured out. Although at some point companies will run out of a place to keep their profits, right? The world is a closed system in that respect. But that I think is a question for an entire other. Maybe it's the job one. The job one that you're going to do. Is there going to be a jobs one?
And we're going to be taking up this issue in part in the Job Symposium on October 20th, and in our continued work. Doug, I'm going to give you the last word, and then I'm just going to say a few very short and sweet words to close this session and this symposium.
Thanks, Charlotte. Just Pat, in response to the question, one thing that Zach just said is, we are getting some of this money back, some of this capital back by the Chinese buying our debt. That's one way. But one of the other ways is the opposite of outsourcing is, insourcing, right? Which is to create an environment in this country in which we are affirmatively going out and trying to attract foreign investment. One of the ways, a simple way is clearly if you have an attractive foreign exchange that, people are getting more bang for their euro, so to speak, then they'll think about it from that perspective. But just the overall climate here, if you go back not so many years ago to the Dubai ports fiasco, for want of a better phrase, we have sent a message to the world. We want you to invest in a very discrete area of our economy, primarily U.S. treasuries on our terms, but we really are very wary of your capital coming back to invest in, for example, our infrastructure, except through these indirect channels by which CFIUS and other rules allow them to, but are basically prohibiting them from investing that capital in a way that might actually contribute to the restoration of growth in this economy. So the only point I would make is one of the answers to your questions, I think, is let's open our arms and be less afraid of attracting foreign capital to some of our broadly defined economic goals, because the capital is there, the liquidity is there. It's a question of whether we're A, hospitable, or B, inviting, or actually sort of making it attractive for them to come. And that would address a lot of some of these issues.
Okay, I want to thank you, Zachary, thank you, Org, thank you, Doug. So this ends the session, and I want to take this opportunity to again thank all of you and all the speakers for making this, I think, a very thought-provoking and hopefully constructive contribution to the debate and discussion. And again, our thanks to Bernard Swartz for his constant support, but as important, his constant guidance in helping us think through these issues. Our next symposium will be October 20th here in DC on the question of jobs and the future of employment in America. And I'm sure that we'll be able to continue many of these interesting conversations at that point. Again, thank you for coming this afternoon.